read a poem in translation, maybe a really famous, widely celebrated Japanese haiku or something, and just walked away feeling this kind of lingering sense of emptiness.
Like you're only getting exactly half the story.
Yes, exactly. It's a bit like walking up to this majestic, incredibly intricate cathedral, but instead of just walking through the front doors, you're forced to look at it through this tiny little brass keyhole.
Right. You can see like a tiny sliver of it.
Yeah, you see the color of the bricks on the opposite wall, or maybe you catch this fleeting glimpse of the light hitting the stone floor, but you completely miss the soaring architecture. You miss the space itself.
Because usually when we talk about a literary translation, there's this really ingrained expectation of precision.
Yeah.
We treat it like engineering.
Right, like you swap a Japanese word for an English word. The bilingual dictionary shows that clean parallel line, and the translator just points at the page and says, there it is, meaning transferred.
Which is, I mean, that assumes human experience is fundamentally binary, right?
Yeah.
Which is a comforting thought, sure, but rarely accurate.
No, not at all.
We desperately want the nuances of literature to be perfectly visible, to be neatly categorized and placed on a shelf. But the reality of language, especially a poetic language separated by centuries and oceans, is that a one-to-one word swap is often just a betrayal of the original intent.
Which becomes glaringly obvious the very second you step into the world of Japanese haiku, specifically through the lens of the renowned translator and scholar R.H. BLYTH.
Oh, absolutely. BLYTH completely changes the game.
He really does. You realize very quickly that a neat little translation dictionary is, frankly, practically useless here. We're stepping into a poetic landscape today that is vast, complex, and incredibly demanding of the person reading it.
Very demanding.
So today's deep dive is unpacking a monumental work, R.H. Blyth's Haiku Volume 2, Spring. And the mission for you, listening right now, is to understand that this isn't just some poetry collection.
No, not even close.
Blyth's work is this masterclass in how to actually perceive the physical world. He uses these tiny 17-syllable windows to view the absolute vastness of human experience.
And we're going to explore his highly unique philosophy today, along with his sort of unorthodox method of using Western literature to explain Eastern aesthetics.
Yeah, and the profound, sometimes surprisingly hilarious ways these poets interacted with their reality. I mean, it's just fascinating stuff.
It really is. And the most fundamental shift Blythe demands of his reader, it actually happens before you even finish the first poem.
Right, because of how we're taught to read in the West.
Exactly. In our literary tradition, we're often trained to be passive observers. We walk through a gallery, we look at the framed poem on the wall, we admire its meter, maybe we analyze the rhyme scheme, and then
Just move on to the next one.
right, we move on. But Blythe shatters that entire framework. He insists that haiku demands something radically different. It demands actual participation.
I love how he articulates this. There's this moment where Blythe quotes a reviewer who's discussing a legendary poem by Basho, the really famous one, about a lonely crow perching on a leafless branch on an autumn evening.
Oh, yeah. We have the crow poem.
Right. And the reviewer makes this incredibly enigmatic comment. He says of the poem, it is for use rather than beauty.
Which is such a striking phrase.
It really is. When I first read that, my immediate thought was that it sounded incredibly industrial. Like, we're talking about a torque wrench or a hammer, not a piece of high art.
It does carry a very utilitarian ring to it.
Yeah.
But if we elevate our understanding of what it actually means to quote-unquote use something, it unlocks the entire genre.
How so?
Well, Blythe explains that this is a perfectly just criticism of all haiku. They are explicitly designed for you to use in your own poetic experience.
So the reader isn't just a consumer.
Exactly. The reader must play a critical, active part in the dynamic recreation of the poem. The poet is only giving you a sketch, like just a few stark charcoal lines.
You have to color it in.
Yes, you, the reader, have to supply the emotional resonance. You must pull from your own reservoir of memory, your own understanding of loneliness or what autumn feels like, to fill in the background and the atmosphere.
Wow.
Blythe actually goes so far as to argue that reading haiku is significantly more exhausting than reading ordinary descriptive poetry, precisely because of this immense psychological demand.
I mean, I like to think of it like downloading a highly compressed ZIP file on a computer.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. The poem itself is that compressed file. It's tiny. It takes up almost zero space, just 17 syllables. But your own mind, your empathy, your lived experience, that is the software required to actually unpack it.
I love that.
If you don't actively run the software, if you just stare at the file sitting there on your desktop, it remains closed. You only see the 17 syllables, but you completely miss the cathedral inside.
That captures the required mental mechanics perfectly.
Hmm.
And, to understand how these poetic ZIP files are categorized and stored in the first place, we have to examine the foundational architecture of the haiku tradition.
Because it's so different from ours.
Completely different. It operates on a completely different logic than Western poetry. BLYTH explicitly contrasts a typical haiku collection with an anthology like Palgrave's Golden Treasury.
Which is a massive staple of English poetic compilation.
Right. If you crack open a standard Western poetry anthology, the organization is usually either chronological, like moving from the Renaissance to the Romantics to the moderns, or it's thematic.
Yeah, you'll find a heavy section on love, a melancholic section on death, maybe a pastoral section on the sea or birds or whatever.
Exactly. The human experience is the organizing principle. But haiku anthologies flip that hierarchy entirely. They are fundamentally and almost exclusively structured by the seasons.
Spring, summer, autumn, winter.
Yes. And this deep, pervasive consciousness of the seasons, it isn't just some convenient filing system for librarians.
Yeah.
It is the absolute bedrock of the art form itself.
The season is the main character.
The season is the primal reality, yeah. And human emotion is secondary to it. BLYTH actually traces this specific consciousness all the way back to the very genesis of Japanese poetry. He points to these ancient, massive collections like the Menyoshu and the Kokinshu.
And just for context, the Menyoshu is an 8th century anthology, so we are talking about poetry written over 1,200 years ago.
Right. And BLYTH notes this fascinating evolution between those eras. In the Menyoshu, you see this deep, wide, incredibly objective love of nature.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning the ancient poets were writing about the physical world as it existed entirely outside of themselves. It wasn't about them.
Okay, got it.
But by the time you reach the Kokinshu, which was compiled about a century and a half later, this subtle but massive shift had occurred.
Oh, what changed?
Well, the culture had become more courtly, more urbanized, far more focused on the internal life. So the real subjects of the poems were no longer the insects or the changing leaves. The focus had become the subjective feelings of the poets themselves.
Ah, so nature was just being repurposed as a symbolic mirror for human emotion.
Precisely. A plum blossom wasn't just a botanical reality anymore. It was a symbol of spring or a symbol of fleeting youth.
Which I know BLYTH identifies as the beginning of a kind of artificiality. He argues that this is the penalty human beings pay for expanding our vision and becoming more introspective, right?
Who does, yeah.
We start seeing a world in a grain of sand, which is beautiful, but we entirely forget to see the sand itself. We lose the grit and the reality of the actual physical object.
And that loss of objective reality really threatened to turn the poetry into just a purely intellectual exercise. BLYTH argues it was the singular genius of Basho in the 17th century who rescued the art form.
Basho comes in and saves the day.
He really did. Basho restored a profound, enriched simplicity. He pulled the poetry back from the brink of becoming too symbolic and too detached from the actual sensory reality of the seasons.
Because if you go too far, it just becomes a math problem.
Exactly. Basho realized that when you systematize nature to an extreme degree, you literally suffocate the poetry. The rigid categorization destroys the spontaneous life of the verse.
And it got pretty extreme, didn't it?
Oh, incredibly extreme. To illustrate how absurd this systematization could get, BLYTH points out that a later poet named Shiki actually created a classified collection with such a bewildering excess of system that the poetry was entirely swamped.
Right.
Shiki documented no less than 50 different classes of fans alone.
Wait, 50? Like 50 distinct classes of handheld fans?
50.
I can't even fathom that. Like, what even are that? You'd have, like, morning fans, evening fans?
Fans for when the cherry blossoms are falling, fans for when the moon is obscured by a cloud.
It sounds utterly exhausting. But, this intense focus on categorization raises an obvious question about the creative process for me.
Sure.
Because the strict rule of haiku is that it must contain a season word, right? A kigo. Doesn't that heavily restricted canvas stifle a poet's creativity? It feels a little bit like painting by numbers.
You'd think so, but the paradox of the form is that the restriction is exactly what forces the innovation.
Really?
Yeah. The season word isn't a pair of handcuffs designed to limit the poet. It is a vital grounding mechanism. It ensures that both the poet and the reader are immediately anchored in a specific, shared, tactile reality.
Okay, that makes sense.
The season is essentially the stage on which the microscopic human drama is allowed to play out.
Right, even if a specific poem seems completely objective, devoid of any explicit human emotion, the underlying season word dictates the emotional frequency of the piece.
Exactly. It takes a tiny, fleeting moment, a frog jumping, a leaf falling, and wires it directly into the massive cyclical rhythm of the cosmos.
And if we want to understand how this massive cosmic rhythm officially resets, we really have to look at the new year. Because in this specific tradition, the new year isn't just a date on a calendar, is it?
No, it's so functionally distinct that it actually gets its own dedicated category, entirely separate from the four traditional seasons.
We have to adjust our chronological expectations here, right? Because under the old lunar calendar used in Japan, the new year didn't fall in the dead frozen center of winter like our January 1st does.
Right, it arrived around what is now early February. So it was the absolute, literal, biological beginning of spring.
Which changes everything.
It changes the entire mood.
Yeah.
If you looked closely in sheltered valleys, the very first plum blossoms were just beginning to show color. So it represents a profound dual rejuvenation.
You have the literal physical rebirth of the natural world happening in lockstep with a fresh psychological reset for humanity.
Yes. It's a sudden, renewed trust in goodness, in the inherent Buddha nature of the world. BLYTH captures this beautifully. He says that on this specific day, the most familiar things you walk past every single day, the clouds, the grass, the running water in the ditch, they suddenly take on a completely new, radiant significance.
He describes this unique psychological state as the tension of sameness and difference, doesn't he?
He does. And if you think about it, look out your window on New Year's Day.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is exactly, physically the same as it was yesterday. The dirt is the same, the trees are the same.
Yeah.
Yet, it is all entirely new because of the profound psychological and spiritual weight of the day itself.
Mm.
There is a poem by the master Isa that illustrates this tension perfectly.
Oh, I know the one.
Isa writes, "At every gate, spring has begun, from the mud on the clogs."
From the mud on the clogs. Let's really look at that image for a second. The clogs being the traditional wooden geta. Mud is universally considered a nuisance, right?
Absolutely.
It's dirty, it tracks into the house, it ruins your floors. It is the definition of mundane grime.
But place that mud on New Year's Day, through the eyes of Isa. That thick black mud sticking to the wooden teeth of the clogs is the ultimate harbinger of spring.
Because it means the ground isn't frozen anymore.
Exactly. It means the frozen earth is finally thawing. It means the paralysis of winter is over and life is moving, literally shifting underfoot.
So he doesn't look up at the sky or at a pristine flower to find the profound beginning of the season. He finds the absolute genesis of spring right there in the dirt sticking to his shoes.
It's incredible.
There's another verse in the collection that operates on that same frequency, but I found the imagery even more startling. It's the verse about pilchards,
Ah, yes.
which, if you don't know, are small, oily forage fish. And the poem reads, "A day of light begins to shine from on the heads of the pilchards."
Just visualize that scene for a moment. You are likely in a loud, smelly fish market, or maybe standing in a cold, damp kitchen. You are looking down at a pile of dead fish.
Yeah, it's an incredibly mundane, unhygienic, and arguably grotesque image by traditional, romantic, Western standards of poetry.
Completely. But the poet's perception is so heightened by the new year that he sees the first pure, unsullied light of the year reflecting off those silvery scales. The divine, the sacred, is actively illuminating the absolute most ordinary, overlooked thing in the world.
Wow. It reminds me of the poem by Ransetsu, New Year's Day. The sky is cloudless, sparrows are gossiping.
That's a great one.
When I first read that, my cynical modern brain immediately thought, well, so what?
Right, because sparrows chatter and gossip every single day of the year.
Exactly. The sky is clear on hundreds of ordinary Tuesdays. BLYTH anticipates that exact reaction from us, doesn't he?
He does. He asks, how is it that on this particular day, these completely normal background noise events suddenly attain this intense poetic life?
And what's the answer?
The answer has nothing to do with the sparrows or the sky, and everything to do with the state of mind of the observer. On New Year's Day, the poet is ideally temporarily cleansed of his usual anxieties.
No worrying about his debts, his prejudices.
Right. He's experiencing a state that BLYTH, actually borrowing a concept from the English Romantic poet William Wordsworth here, calls the philosophic mind.
Because the pod is empty of his own ego, he's able to see the sparrows not just as noisy pests fighting over crumbs, but as sovereign fellow creatures actively sharing in the vital waking energy of the new spring.
Exactly. There is a remarkably relatable poem by Ichiku that captures this emotional reset too. It goes, "The dawn of New Year's Day. Yesterday. How far off."
Oh man, it perfectly encapsulates that feeling. When the heavy, mundane world of paying bills, doing your taxes, arguing with your neighbor, all that crushing yesterday baggage, it suddenly feels like it belongs to a completely different lifetime.
You wake up on that holiday morning and the slate is wiped entirely clean. All is peace.
It is a sudden, sharp, almost violent reset of the soul.
It is. Blythe highlights another verse where the poet abandons all pretense of poetic language and simply bursts out. New Year's Day. What luck. What luck. The sky is cloudless.
I found that verse so incredibly striking. What luck. What luck. The sky is cloudless. It almost reads like something a child would yell out the window.
It does.
Does this imply that the true, ultimate mastery of haiku is the ability to drop all our highbrow academic aesthetic standards?
Yes.
Like to stop trying to write capital P poetry with complex metaphors and just be a regular, vulnerable human being who is genuinely thrilled by the warmth of a sunny day?
Blythe argues that this is the absolute pinnacle of the art.
Mm.
The poet in that moment is no longer a highbrow intellectual. He is simply a man alive in the world. He has achieved a level of magnanimity that allows him to transcend pettiness without exerting the slightest effort.
Because the new year forces a kind of radical spiritual simplicity. You just exist and you are grateful for the sun.
Right. But human nature being what it is, that sharp, crystalline reset of the new year, it cannot last forever.
Right. Eventually, the holiday ends, the bills return, and you settle into the actual ongoing rhythm of the season.
And spring, in the context of haiku, has a very specific, incredibly heavy texture to it.
Heavy. Because when we think of spring in the West, we often think of bounding lambs, blooming daffodils, and a general sense of light, skipping energy.
We do. But a massive, recurring theme of spring in these Japanese poems is the overwhelming essence of the long day.
A long day.
Yes. The long day, which is long by direct contrast to the short, dark, restrictive days of winter, is characterized in haiku by a profound lethargy, a heavy tranquility, and a psychological sense of time stretching out so far that it almost loses meaning.
And the poets capture this not through sweeping landscapes, but through hyper-focused, static images, right?
Precisely. Shiki is a perfect example, a kite down on a low tree, the spring day.
And we aren't talking about a paper toy kite here.
No, a kite is a fierce bird of prey. Usually you picture them soaring aggressively in the high currents. But here, the fierce bird is just sitting heavily on a low branch, doing absolutely nothing.
The day is so long it has sapped even the predator's energy.
Exactly. And Shiki has another one, gazing at a 3-foot garden, one spring day.
My absolute favorite, though, is the recurring image of a fowl, just a common chicken covering itself in warm, dry dust.
Yes. Let's dissect the image of that fowl, because it's so important. Blythe is very careful to warn us against reading this merely as ornithology.
Right.
We shouldn't look at this and say, ah, yes, an accurate description of avian dust-bathing behavior.
That misses the point entirely.
Yes, the physical reality is that the chicken is taking a dust bath. But the poetic demand is different. We must look at the verse and see simultaneously the fowl in its absolute foulishness, its literal, dusty, scratching reality, and at the exact same time see the fowl as the physical embodiment of the entire season.
So the lethargic, dusty bird doesn't just represent the spring day, it literally is the spring day.
Precisely the distinction. To truly comprehend the essence of that fowl, you have to see it as the vast spring compressed into a single form. And to truly understand the vast spring, you have to feel the spirit of that drowsy, contented bird. The poet's own lethargy, his own heavy tranquility, is in total harmony with the atmospheric pressure of the spring day.
And that shared state of being is expressed exclusively through the image of the bird.
Yes.
I have to pause here, though. I want to look critically at the 3-foot garden poem you mentioned.
Okay.
Gazing at a 3-foot garden. One spring day, the narrator is literally just staring blankly at a tiny 3-foot enclosed courtyard garden for an entire day.
Right.
Isn't there a danger that Blythe, and by extension us, are projecting massive, unearned philosophical weight onto a poem about a guy who is profoundly bored?
It's a fair question.
Where do we draw the line between a state of cosmic, profound lethargy and a guy who just ate a really heavy rice meal and desperately needs a nap?
Well, that skepticism is entirely necessary when you're reading translated poetry with heavy commentary. It's so easy to over-intellectualize. But Blyth's defense is that the miniature garden acts as a focal point.
A focal point for what?
It expresses the completeness, the crushing monotony, and the absolute stillness of a spring day. He actually links this heavy feeling to a concept from the American transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Emerson.
Yeah, Emerson wrote about the systole and diastole of the human spirit.
Systole and diastole, that's the medical terminology for the contracting and relaxing of a heart muscle, pumping blood, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. The heartbeat of the universe. Emerson proposed that the human spirit inherently desires the finite, the small, and the bounded, right after it has been exhausted and satiated with the infinite.
Oh, wow.
So the weariness of the soul on a long spring day isn't just physical tiredness from a heavy meal. In the Japanese context, which is heavily saturated with Indian Buddhist thought, this specific lethargy is inextricably bound up with a deep physical feeling of the evanescence of things.
So the passage of time slows down so much that it crosses over from being a concept into being an actual heavy physical sensation weighing on your shoulders.
Exactly. You stare at the 3-foot garden because looking at the infinite sky is simply too exhausting.
That concept of the sky being exhausting ties into another poem, where the oppressive length of the day is measured not by hours or clocks, but by the futility of human labor.
Right, the laborers in the distance.
Yeah, the narrator is looking out over a massive flat field or maybe a sprawling beach and sees men working way off in the distance. They look like tiny, insignificant ants on the horizon.
It highlights a deep sense of pathos.
The day is incredibly long, the sky is vast, and the human effort feels incredibly small, completely swallowed up by the scale of the season.
The pathetic nature of man who toils in the dirt, sowing where he may not even reap, the physical warmth of the earth, the sweat evaporating off the laborers' bodies, the endless, indifferent sky above them, all of these elements fuse together to create that distinct, heavy texture of the spring day.
It's beautiful, but to successfully make these massive conceptual leaps, to jump from a sleeky chicken taking a dust bath to the unfulfilled, pathetic ambition of the human soul, BLYTH relies on a really fascinating and, frankly, highly unorthodox toolset.
Very unorthodox.
This is where BLYTH's unique genius as a translator really shines. He isn't just translating words, he's building massive cross-cultural bridges.
And his comparative method is arguably the most distinctive and, honestly, controversial feature of his life's work.
Why controversial?
Well, to explain incredibly nuanced Japanese aesthetic and philosophical concepts to a 20th century Western reader, he refuses to rely solely on Eastern religious texts. Instead, he constantly aggressively reaches for Western literary and philosophical giants.
The text is a veritable who's who of Western thought. I mean, he is dropping names on every single page.
He really is. We already mentioned how he used Wordsworth's concept of the philosophic mind.
Right, which Wordsworth explored in massive poems like Resolution and Independence or Tintern Abbey. And BLYTH uses that to explain the quiet, egoless acceptance in a haiku about a man realizing he's getting older on New Year's Day.
Exactly. He uses the English romantics, Keats and Shelley, to explain the Japanese perception of birdsong. He brings in the Victorian poet Matthew Arnold to explain the deep, animistic Shinto concept of the Age of the Gods, the Kamiyo.
He even quotes from Edmund Spenser's 16th century sonnet sequence, Amoretti.
And he brings in the Welsh poet W.H. Davies, referencing Davies's lines about a rainbow and a cuckoo song, all just to help a Western mind grasp the idyllic, almost fairy tale sense of unity in a Japanese verse about a tame swallow interacting with a beautiful girl.
Returning to our computer analogy from the beginning, it's as if BLYTH recognizes that the Western reader is running a completely different mental operating system.
That's a great way to put it.
He takes the Eastern software, the haiku, the underlying Zen concepts, and he writes an emulation layer. He runs it flawlessly through European Romantic poetry and German philosophy so that our Western operating system can actually render and read the output.
And that emulation layer is crucial because he understands that he is translating cultural frequencies, not just dictionary definitions.
Right.
He knows that if he simply tells a Western reader, this poem embodies the state of Zen detachment and mu or emptiness, the reader will nod politely, but feel absolutely nothing.
It's just a vocab word.
Exactly. But if he connects that exact same Japanese poem to Wordsworth's famous feeling of a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, suddenly a massive bridge is built. The Western reader recognizes the frequency.
The most ambitious and perhaps the wildest bridge he builds is with the controversial German philosopher Oswald Spengler.
Oh, the Spengler connection is wild.
Spengler wrote this massive, dense work called The Decline of the West, where he theorized about these huge civilizational archetypes. He talked about the Apollonian soul, the Faustian soul, and the Magian soul.
And BLYTH uses this incredibly dense early 20th century German philosophy to explain a 17-syllable poem by Busan about hearing a tiny bird.
It is a breathtaking intellectual maneuver. Can we unpack that Spengler connection?
Yeah, let's do it. So Spengler defined the Apollonian soul, which is the classical Greek and Roman mindset, as being obsessed with the pure physical present, with the tangible body, and with closed, finite spaces. Think of a Greek statue.
Okay, very bounded.
Right. Then there's the Faustian soul, which Spengler associated with the modern West. This is characterized by a constant agonizing yearning for the infinite. It is obsessed with endless space, with telescopes looking into the void, with calculus and limitless expansion.
Always pushing outward.
Exactly. And then the Magian soul, associated with the Middle East, he viewed as experiencing the world as a magical, enclosed cavern.
Okay, so we have these massive archetypes. How on earth does BLYTH connect Faustian yearning and Apollonian statues to a poem about an ugisu, a Japanese bush warbler?
Well, the Busan verse goes, all day long the voices of the Ugisu were far off. This day, too, is drawn to its close.
Okay.
BLYTH focuses on Spengler's concept of distance impressions. Spengler argued that distance impressions attach themselves seamlessly to our sense of the future and our yearning for the infinite.
Oh, I see.
BLYTH argues that in this tiny poem, the fading, distant voice of the bird merges space and time into a single entity. The physical world stretches out into an infinite Faustian distance through the fading sound, and the long hours of the spring day are physically swallowed up in that vast space. The ear tracks the distance, and the soul feels the time passing.
Wow. What's even more fascinating, though, is that BLYTH isn't just blindly agreeing with his Western sources. He actively uses haiku to correct them.
He takes on Spengler directly at one point.
Yeah. Spengler apparently wrote that it would be too fantastic to argue something of religious world feeling in the Song of the Mounting Lark.
Essentially, Spengler is saying that a bird singing is just a biological function. It's an animal making noise to mate or claim territory. It cannot contain a profound civilizational religious experience.
And BLYTH just drops a poem by Basho to prove the German philosopher completely wrong.
The Basho poem he uses is perfectly chosen. In the midst of the plains sings the skylark, free of all things.
Free of all things.
BLYTH asserts that Basho's lived poetic experiences were infinitely deeper than Spengler's philosophical theorizing from his armchair. Basho proves that there absolutely is a religious world feeling in the bird's song.
The skylark, singing high above the empty plain, becomes the ultimate soaring expression of being completely unattached, entirely free of the crushing burdens of the human ego.
Exactly.
But, every operating system and every translator has inherent biases.
Sure.
If we accept BLYTH as our master translator, we also have to critically examine the specific religious and philosophical lens he insists on using to view the entire world.
And that's a very necessary critique.
Because while he uses Western poets to build bridges, the core underlying philosophy he constantly points back to, his true north, is Zen Buddhism.
Yes.
And examining the sources closely reveals that by forcing everything through a Zen filter, BLYTH might actually be missing massive parts of the Japanese tapestry.
This is a vital critical point for anyone reading BLYTH.
Yeah.
He heavily, almost exclusively, insists on interpreting these haikus through the strict lens of Zen philosophy.
He constantly references Zen ideals like the wordless doctrine, right?
Yes, the wordless doctrine famously taught at the Yuji Temple, where ultimate truth cannot be spoken, only experienced. He views the ideal state of the haiku poet as one of absolute Zen detachment, a state where we are everything precisely because we have dissolved our separate illusionary egos.
There's a genuinely funny example in the text of BLYTH twisting a poem to fit his Zen framework. It's a poem by a poet named Ryota about walking into a garden.
Oh, I know the one.
The verse is, I came back, angry and offended, the willow in the garden. So Ryota has been insulted or angered by someone, he storms back home, and suddenly he's confronted by the sweeping beauty of a willow tree.
And BLYTH's Zen analysis of this moment is pretty wild.
It is. He argues that from a strict Zen perspective, Ryota's problem wasn't that he was angry, his problem was that he wasn't angry enough.
It sounds totally paradoxical, but the Zen logic follows a strict internal consistency.
Explain that because it sounds crazy.
BLYTH argues that if Ryota had been truly, wholly, completely angry, if there was no separation between his core being and the emotion of anger, he would have been completely blind to the external world. He wouldn't have even noticed the garden.
Okay.
Because his anger was weak and partial, it left a gap in his consciousness. His mind was still divided, which allowed it to be suddenly aroused and distracted by the objective beauty of the willow tree.
It's a fascinating, if slightly rigid, psychological reading. But if we pull back and look at the actual source material, the raw poems themselves, they reveal a much richer, much messier, and far more diverse religious and cultural reality in Japan.
It wasn't an entire nation of detached Zen monks meditating on willows.
Not at all. We see heavy Shinto influences with its deep animism and reverence for the age of the gods. We see echoes of Confucian social order. And then there is a deeply dramatic, bloody historical moment captured in one of the verses that involves Christianity.
The verse concerning the Fumi. It is perhaps one of the most powerful and complex in the collection. It requires us to step out of poetry and into brutal history.
Tell us about the Fumi.
During the Tokugawa shogunate, beginning in the early 17th century, the Japanese government enacted ruthless laws to eradicate Christianity, which they viewed as a destabilizing foreign influence.
Right.
To enforce this, they implemented a devastating test. Suspected Christians, and eventually the general populace in certain areas, were forced to publicly tread on a fumi. This was a brass or wooden plaque bearing the carved image of Jesus Christ or the Virgin Mary.
And if you refuse?
If you refused to step on the holy image, you were tortured and executed.
Wow, that's heavy. The poem captures a woman in the act of taking that step. But the crucial detail is that as she physically steps on the image of Christ, she is verbally reciting the Buddhist Nembutsu chant.
The psychological and spiritual complexity of that moment is staggering.
It really is. The Nembutsu is a chant invoking the infinite compassion of Amida Buddha, right?
Yes. By capturing the moment where the woman recites a plea for Buddhist mercy while her foot desecrates the Christian savior just to save her own life, the poet highlights a profound tragedy.
But beneath the tragedy, the poem suggests a radical theological unity.
Exactly. The core teachings of both figures, Christ and Amida Buddha, are not opposed in this moment of suffering. They both represent ultimate values of gentleness, meekness, and self-sacrificing compassion. The woman is trapped in the violent machinery of the state, relying on the grace of both figures.
This is a stunning intersection of faiths that exists completely outside the cool, detached realm of strict Zen observation.
Completely outside it. And speaking of the Nembutsu and Amida Buddha, BLYTH himself is eventually forced to acknowledge a massive fundamental difference between Zen Buddhism and Shin Buddhism, which is also known as true Pure Land Buddhism.
The notes emphasize that this distinction completely alters how you read the poetry.
It is the difference between night and day in terms of spiritual approach. Zen is fundamentally a rigorous path of self-reliance. Through intense meditation, strict discipline, and direct insight, you strive to realize that your individual ego is an illusion. You achieve enlightenment by realizing that we are everything.
Right. And Shin Buddhism.
Shin Buddhism, which was immensely popular among the common people, is a path of absolute other reliance. It posits that we live in Mappo, a degenerate, corrupted age. Human beings are too inherently flawed, too burdened by karma and desire to ever achieve enlightenment through their own effort.
So what's the path then?
In Shin Buddhism, we are essentially nothing. Salvation comes not from our own meditation, but by relying entirely, desperately, on the unearned grace and infinite compassion of Amida Buddha.
We are everything versus we are nothing. If you apply those two different lenses to a poem, you get two entirely different meanings.
You really do.
Take the haiku by the poet Issa, where the birds in the trees are singing Hokkekyo, which happens to sound exactly like the name of the famous Buddhist Lotus Sutra. BLYTH observes that this poem doesn't leave us feeling detached or enlightened.
No, it leaves us with a profound feeling of lacrimae rerum.
A Latin phrase meaning the tears of things,
Yeah.
right? A deep, resonant sense of worldly pathos and sorrow.
Yes, that specific feeling of powerlessness, the awareness of our shared vulnerability, the desperate reliance on grace that is the absolute hallmark of Shin Buddhism. Issa was actually a devout Shin Buddhist priest.
Oh, it was?
Yes. If you try to force Issa's poetry into a box of detached, cool Zen observation, you violently strip away the profound, aching empathy that is the very engine of his art. You begin to realize these legendary poets weren't all untouchable sages living on mountaintops. Many of them were deeply wounded, vulnerable human beings crying out for grace.
Let me test this Zen versus Shin idea with a famous poem by Toshitsu.
Go for it.
It's a poem about viewing the legendary cherry blossoms of Mount Yoshino. The poem is literally just, I said, it was all that I could say. The cherry flowers of Mount Yoshino.
Classic.
Now, from a Zen perspective, isn't this the ultimate proof that the wordless doctrine is correct? When you are confronted with something of absolute overwhelming beauty, the intellect short circuits. The only true, authentic response is a speechless gasp.
It is a fiercely debated poem, actually. Critics of the verse argue that it is fundamentally defective because it is empty. You could swap out cherry flowers for a beautiful sunset or the Grand Canyon, and the poem remains exactly the same.
Oh, interesting point.
But BLYTH defends it vigorously from the Zen point of view. He argues that when you truly perceive reality in its purest form, unmediated by thought, all intellectual categorization fails immediately. The gasp of, "ah," is the poem. Any descriptive words added to it would only dilute the purity of the experience.
It's a fascinating divide. On one hand, you have the detached, speechless gasp of Zen when confronted with beauty. On the other hand, you have the vulnerable, tearful grace of Shin Buddhism when confronted with the suffering of the world.
And absolutely no one in the history of the genre exemplifies this vulnerable, deeply human, muddy approach to existence better than the poet we just mentioned, Issa.
We have to look closely at Issa's earthy empathy because the way he interacts with the animal kingdom is nothing short of revolutionary.
Issa's body of work is characterized by a profound, almost radical lack of human conceit. He does not view himself as sitting atop a biological hierarchy.
He doesn't view animals as lesser creatures placed on Earth for his amusement or use. He explicitly refers to the birds and insects as his cousins or second cousins.
There is a remarkably funny poem about a frog that captures this perfectly.
Oh, I love this one.
The frog looks at me, but with a sour face.
We've all had that moment where an animal seems to be judging us, but to actually enshrine it in a poem is brilliant. I always picture the hookah-smoking caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland just blowing smoke and judging Alice's every word.
Exactly.
Issa's just sitting in the mud, minding his own business, and this frog is looking at him with utter disdain, like Issa is a complete fool.
But what is philosophically crucial to understand here is that Issa is not anthropomorphizing the frog to make a cute Disney-style joke.
Right.
He isn't projecting human emotions onto the animal to make it relatable.
So what's he doing?
As BLYTH astutely points out, the humor arises from Issa's complete lack of self-centeredness. Issa genuinely feels that the frog, as a sovereign entity, is entirely justified in its sour look.
He acknowledges that the frog has an independent existence.
Yes, a perspective of its own, and from that perspective a human being might very well look ridiculous.
He applies this exact same level of respect to sparrows, doesn't he?
He does. There's a verse where he observes a flock of sparrows and notes that they look exhausted and serious, as if they just got back from a long, arduous religious pilgrimage to the famous Zenkoji temple.
And the dynamic is even more complex in a poem involving a child and an animal. The verse goes, "The little girl playing ball now makes a face at the mewing kitten."
The psychological layering in that tiny poem is astounding. The kitten is mewing incessantly because it feels ignored. It wants to be involved in the game of ball.
And the little girl responds by making a face at it. Literally, the Japanese text describes her performing a kanbi, the gesture of pulling down her lower eyelid and sticking out her tongue to express childish derision.
BLYTH points out that the true profound zen of this mundane moment is that the little girl is treating the kitten entirely as another human child.
Right. The kitten isn't a pet to be coddled or ignored as a dumb animal. It's a peer. It's an annoying playmate who is interrupting her game.
Issa perfectly captures that complete absence of species hierarchy.
But to truly understand why Issa's empathy runs so agonizingly deep, we have to look at the tragic reality of his personal background.
The historical notes emphasize that Issa lost his mother when he was only 3 years old.
3. That's heartbreaking.
He was a deeply lonely orphan, often mistreated by his stepmother. And that childhood trauma completely informs his worldview. There is a poem that is genuinely difficult to read without tearing up. Come and play with me, fatherless, motherless sparrow.
Wow, it is a devastating piece of poetry. On the surface, Issa explicitly identifies with the baby sparrow because he, too, knows the cold reality of being an orphan.
But the philosophical empathy goes much deeper than shared biography. BLYTH suggests that, through his own suffering, Issa arrived at a profound conclusion. All finite things, whether animate or inanimate, human or insect, are ultimately alone.
We are all essentially orphaned by the very brutal fact of coming into existence, of being separated from the infinite source.
Yes.
It's as if Issa is a tragic, cosmic Dr. Dolittle, but instead of learning to talk to the animals so he can solve their practical problems or organize them into a society, he just walks into the absurd, confusing waiting room of existence, sits down on the bench next to a frog and a sparrow, and silently acknowledges that we are all stuck in the exact same terrifying, lonely boat.
The absurd waiting room of existence that is a remarkably apt, almost existentialist way to describe Issa's landscape. He feels an intense, almost crushing sense of personal responsibility toward these tiny creatures.
Give me an example of that.
There is an incredible poem where a white butterfly begins to follow him as he walks down a dusty city street. Most people wouldn't notice, or if they did, they'd simply think, oh, how pretty. Issa's reaction is entirely different. He feels a sudden pang of guilt. He worries that he has actively deceived the butterfly.
Deceived it.
Yes. He feels responsible because this fragile, wavering little creature has seemingly fallen in love with him. And because it is following him, it isn't out in the fields looking for the flowers it needs to survive.
Oh my goodness. His empathy actually drives him to anger on behalf of the insects, too. There's a story where he literally yells at people in a room to open a window for a trapped bug.
Yeah.
Why don't you open the window for that horsefly to get out? He bawls at someone. The fly is violently buzzing and banging its head against the glass skylight trying to escape. Everyone else is ignoring the background noise, but Issa can't stand it.
He cannot tolerate the artificial separation between his own comfort and the immediate, frantic suffering of the fly.
That is the essence of Issa. It is a muddy, humorous, agonizingly empathetic, ground-level view of spring. Issa is down in the dirt with the judging frogs, the orphan sparrows, and the mud on the wooden clogs.
But to grasp the full spectrum of the haiku landscape that BLYTH presents, we must contrast Issa's raw emotion with another absolute grandmaster of the form, Buisson.
Right, because Buisson operates on a completely different, highly refined frequency.
Very different. If Issa gives us the muddy ground and the sweating laborers, Buisson elevates us into a purely aesthetic, intensely cinematic atmosphere.
Buisson was not just a poet, he was a highly accomplished painter, right?
He was.
Yeah.
And he was deeply romantically influenced by classical Chinese poetry, specifically the golden age of the Tang dynasty.
BLYTH makes a profound observation about him. He notes that Buisson essentially lived in the past in order to make it vividly alive in the present.
Buisson brings a highly constructed visual elegance and a painterly detachment to his work that stands in stark contrast to Issa's spontaneous, bleeding heart empathy.
Buisson's poems read exactly like instructions for a cinematographer. Take this verse. Indifferent and languid, I burn some incense, an evening of spring.
So evocative.
You don't just read that poem, you step into the frame. You can practically smell the sandalwood. You can see the thin line of smoke curling up in a dim, richly shadowed room. The atmosphere is thick enough to cut.
Or consider his brilliant technique for handling human presence. He rarely shows you the action directly. He writes, he sleeps late. There are his straw sandals that trod the fallen petals.
Exactly. He refuses to show us the man actually walking through the blooming orchard. It's like a master movie director making a deliberate stylistic choice.
Right.
Instead of showing us the grueling hike, the director cuts to a tight shot of muddy hiking boots left abandoned by the front door. We only see the physical traces of the action.
The man is hidden away, asleep inside the house. The straw sandals are sitting outside on the porch, and trapped in the woven straw are a few bruised pink cherry petals. It forces the reader's imagination to construct the entire narrative of the previous day's journey.
But look, does this highly constructed, deliberate framing make Buisson's work inherently more artificial than Issa's? Or are we just looking at a completely different manifestation of genius?
BLYTH would vigorously argue for the latter. It is a different manifestation of genius, serving a different philosophical end. Where Issa seeks to merge completely and painfully with the present moment and the living creature in front of him, Buisson deliberately creates distance.
He creates space in order to capture the elusive atmosphere of time passing.
Look at how Buisson handles the transition at the end of the season. He writes a poem about sweeping up the fallen leaves in the train of departing spring.
He literally personifies spring, which feels incredibly jarring. You usually don't get that kind of Greek-style capital letter personification spring walking away in a trailing robe in Japanese poetry.
It does feel unusual. And Blythe anticipates that a modern cynical reader might immediately dismiss this personification as a primitive animistic trick, or perhaps just a stale, superstitious literary convention.
Right.
But Blythe argues that in Boussin's hands, it is actually a profound artistic mechanism designed to capture the invisible transition of time. Spring is a massive, abstract concept you can't actually see it leave.
But the fallen blossoms and leaves swirling on the ground.
Those are the physical, tangible evidence that the conceptual entity of spring has packed its bags and moved on. The leaves are the wake left by a passing ship.
There is another verse about the end of the season that is so incredibly subtle, it borders on magic.
Which one?
Departing spring hesitates in the late cherry blossoms.
Oh, yes.
The season wants to leave, the calendar says it is time to go, but the essence of spring is lingering, hesitating in those last few stubborn flowers that refuse to drop their petals.
The deployment of that specific word, hesitates, is a stroke of absolute brilliance. Blythe explains that this single word perfectly captures the agonizing dual nature of reality itself.
How so?
On one hand, there is a powerful conservative force in the universe. Things desperately want to stay exactly as they are forever. Spring wants to remain an eternal spring. We want to stay young.
Right.
But on the other hand, there is an equally powerful, unstoppable force driving things to change, to decay, to grow into the next inevitable season.
And those late cherry blossoms embody that exact terrible moment of indolent vacillation. They are the physical, fragile manifestation of the universe's indecision before it inevitably yields to summer. It is a breathtaking amount of philosophy to pack into a few syllables. Let's look back at the immense territory we've covered today.
It's a lot.
We started by examining the strict, unyielding architecture of the seasonal categories, realizing that the season word isn't a prison, but an anchor to reality. We experienced the sharp spiritual reset of the new year, learning how to find the sacred spark in dead fish heads and muddy wooden shoes.
We waded through the heavy physical lethargy of the long spring day, discovering that a dusty, resting chicken can somehow contain the entire weight of the cosmos.
We analyzed Blythe's daring architectural work, watching him build conceptual bridges out of Wordsworth, Keats, and the dense historical theories of Spengler, translating not just vocabulary, but the deep cultural frequencies of the East for a Western mind.
We navigated the profound, often overlooked theological divide between the cool, egoless detachment of Zen and the tearful, vulnerable reliance on grace found in Shin Buddhism.
We sat in the dirt with Issa, sharing the absurd waiting room of existence with sour-faced frogs and orphan sparrows, feeling the frantic panic of a trapped horsefly. And finally, we admired Boussin's cinematic, beautifully constructed tracking shots of spring's reluctant departure.
It is a staggering amount of perspective packed into verses that, combined, use fewer words than a standard email.
And every single piece of it returns to that central, demanding thesis Blythe established at the very beginning. These poems are not objects of passive beauty. They are tools for use. They are instruments for recalibrating your perception of reality.
Exactly.
Which brings us full circle. If reading a standard translation is like looking through a tiny brass keyhole, R.H. Blythe hasn't just handed us the key. He has essentially kicked the cathedral doors wide open. He has forced us to look at the sweeping architecture inside.
He really has.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to chew on as you transition back into your day. We exist in a hyper-fast, digitally saturated modern reality. Our attention is fractured into seconds, constantly pulled in 1,000 different directions by notifications, anxieties, and the relentless pace of progress.
It's exhausting.
In an environment like that, perhaps the ultimate, most radical act of rebellion isn't to unplug completely or move to the woods. Perhaps the most radical act is to adopt the mental operating system of a haiku poet.
I love that.
Not to sit down and write 17 syllables, but to relentlessly practice the intense, uncompromising attention the form requires. The next time you see a common bird kicking up dust in a parking lot, or you notice a streak of mud on your shoe, or you feel the sudden, irritable urge to swat a fly buzzing against a window pane, can you pause? Can you drop your ego just for one agonizing second, run that deeply human mental software, and see if you can perceive the entire vast universe expressing itself perfectly in that single fleeting moment?